Ethan Lancaster entered La Maison Daylight with the ease of a man accustomed to the world bending to his will. The soft click of his Italian leather shoes echoed faintly on the polished marble floors as the maitre d', dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, approached him with the kind of reverence reserved for royalty. "Mr. Lancaster, welcome," the maitre d' said, bowing slightly. "Your usual table is ready." Ethan nodded, barely glancing at the man as he was escorted to his seat. The restaurant, with its dim lighting and hushed conversations, exuded exclusivity. Ethan often thought of this place as his sanctuary, a retreat from the noise of the world. A space where he could bask in the quiet assurance that he belonged at the top. He settled into his chair, his gaze sweeping across the room. The other diners, each cloaked in wealth and privilege, mirrored the image he held of himself: accomplished, deserving, untouchable. Everything was as it should be, until his eyes fell on a table tucked discreetly into the corner of the room. A black family sat there, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The man wore a tailored suit, its subtle pinstripes catching the low light. The woman's dress was simple but elegant, a soft green that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin. The children, impeccably behaved, sat with perfect posture as they studied their menus. They were talking quietly, their smiles warm and unforced. Ethan frowned. Something about them felt out of place, though he couldn't immediately articulate why. They weren't loud, they weren't drawing attention to themselves. In fact, they were the very picture of refinement. And yet, their presence unsettled him. He took a sip of his wine, hoping the irritation would pass. But it lingered. What are they doing here? The thought surfaced unbidden, carrying with it a discomfort Ethan couldn't name, though it nestled itself easily within him. La Maison Daylight wasn't just a restaurant, it was a symbol. A testament to the order of things. In Ethan's mind, it was a place where success and status were rewarded, where the right kind of people gathered to celebrate their deserved ascension above the fray. That family, for all their apparent composure, didn't fit into the world Ethan had constructed for himself. He watched as the man Samuel, Ethan would later learn, leaned slightly toward his wife, whispering something that made her laugh softly. The children smiled at each other, their faces full of a quiet joy that Ethan found disconcerting. He set his wine glass down with more force than he intended, earning a glance from a passing waiter. Ethan's mood darkened. He had worked too hard to rise above the chaos of ordinary life to share his space with those who hadn't, in his estimation, earned it. Wealth, to Ethan, was more than a number, it was a declaration of belonging. A key that unlocked doors meant to remain closed to others. And yet, here they were, occupying a space he felt was his. Their presence a silent affront to his understanding of the world. Across the room, Samuel Carter noticed Ethan's glare but chose not to acknowledge it. Years of experience had taught him when to engage and when to let the weight of someone else's discomfort rest solely on their shoulders. His focus returned to his wife, Celeste, who smiled at him with an ease that reminded him of why they had come here tonight, to celebrate Ava's acceptance into an advanced academic program and Nathaniel's victory at a regional science fair. Their children's accomplishments were the kind of quiet triumphs that didn't require fanfare but deserved recognition all the same. Samuel glanced around the room, noting the occasional sideways glances from other patrons. Most were subtle, their curiosity polite, but there were always a few who struggled to mask their discomfort. He had learned long ago that these moments were less about him or his family and more about the silent assumptions that trailed them wherever they went. Celeste, sensing his distraction, reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Ignore it," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "This is our night." Samuel nodded, his expression softening. Celeste had a way of grounding him, reminding him of what truly mattered. The children, oblivious to the undercurrents around them, continued their conversation about Ava's upcoming project. Their innocence was something Samuel and Celeste worked hard to protect. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled to quell the unease roiling inside him. He prided himself on his control, on his ability to maintain composure even in the face of disruptions. But tonight, that composure felt thin, brittle. He looked around the room, searching for signs that others shared his unease. But most diners seemed content to focus on their meals. It made Ethan feel even more isolated in his discomfort. He glanced back at the family, his gaze narrowing. They weren't loud, disruptive, or inappropriate in any way. In fact, their grace and poise only magnified his irritation. Ethan had always believed in the fairness of his world, a world where hard work and success determined one's place. And yet, here was a family who seemed to challenge that belief merely by existing. As the waiter approached with his entree, Ethan leaned back in his chair, attempting to regain a sense of control. But the presence of the Carters had already disrupted the delicate balance of his evening. He didn't understand why it mattered so much to him, but it did, and that was enough to ensure he wouldn't let it go. Ethan Lancaster was a man who thrived on certainty, on the assurance that the world operated as he believed it should. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully grasp, that certainty was slipping away, and the fault lines of his carefully constructed world were beginning to show. This chapter sets the tone for the novel by exploring Ethan's internal conflict and the subtle, insidious nature of prejudice. The quiet dignity of Samuel's family contrasts sharply with Ethan's growing discomfort, highlighting the broader societal tensions at play. The writing style is restrained, focusing on the unspoken dynamics of privilege and exclusion. The morning after his visit to La Maison Daylight, Ethan Lancaster sat in his corner office, bathed in the muted gray light of a cloudy day. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, a view he often found reassuring. Today, though, it felt distant, as though he were observing it from another man's life. He turned his chair slightly, looking away from the glass, and stared at the reports on his desk. They required his attention, yet his mind wandered back to the restaurant and the family he had seen. The irritation that had bubbled up then had not dissipated. If anything, it lingered, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. It wasn't the first time Ethan had encountered something or someone that unsettled him. But usually, he found ways to rationalize those moments, brushing them off as inconsequential. This felt different. The composed demeanor of Samuel Carter and his family had lodged itself in his mind. Not because they were disruptive or out of place, but because they were so clearly at ease. Their calm, quiet presence had left Ethan feeling exposed in a way he couldn't explain. He tapped his pen against the edge of his desk, the rhythm matching the muted ticking of the clock on the wall. His assistant, Claire, knocked softly before entering with a folder. "Your 9 o'clock meeting is confirmed," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "Is there anything else you need?" "No," Ethan replied curtly, waving her away. Claire hesitated for a moment before retreating. He didn't notice. His focus had shifted back to his thoughts, replaying the scene at the restaurant like a film on a loop. Elsewhere in the city, Samuel Carter sipped his morning coffee in the sunlit kitchen of his home. The hum of the coffee maker blended with the quiet chatter of Ava and Nathaniel as they prepared for school. Celeste moved with practiced efficiency, packing lunches and glancing occasionally at the clock. It was an ordinary morning, the kind they had worked hard to preserve. Samuel, however, was distracted. His mind lingered on the man from the restaurant, the way he had approached their table with an air of practiced dominance. He recognized that kind of confidence. It was the armor of someone who rarely faced resistance, who saw the world as a mirror reflecting back his own sense of importance. "What are you thinking about?" Celeste asked, setting a plate of toast in front of him. "The man from last night," Samuel replied. "The way he looked at us." Celeste gave a small, knowing nod. She had seen it too. "It's not new," she said, her tone measured, but it felt sharper. "Didn't it? Like he wasn't just annoyed but offended." Samuel nodded. "Exactly, as if our being there disrupted something he held sacred." Their conversation paused as Ava and Nathaniel entered. Ready for school, Samuel ruffled Nathaniel's hair and kissed Ava on the forehead, offering them both a reassuring smile. "Have a good day." "You too." As the children left, the kitchen grew quiet again. Celeste sat across from Samuel, her expression thoughtful. People like him, they're used to being the center of gravity. The world bends around them. Seeing us, a family like ours, in a place like that, it challenges their sense of order. Samuel took a sip of his coffee, his jaw tightening slightly. "He didn't challenge me directly. Not really. But his presence, His tone, it was enough. You handled it well, Celeste said. And the children didn't notice much. Which is what matters. Back at the office, Ethan finally turned his attention to the day's tasks. Yet as he moved from one meeting to the next, a subtle tension followed him. It was in the clipped tones of his emails, the way he interrupted his colleagues during discussions, and the sharpness of his responses to minor inconveniences. By mid-afternoon, even he could sense the strain. It wasn't the first time Ethan had felt out of sorts. But this time, he couldn't pinpoint why. Was it truly about the Carters? Or was it something deeper? Something about the fragility of the world he had built for himself? He brushed the thought aside. There was no room for self-doubt. Not now. That evening, at another corner of the city, Gregory Blake, a man of quiet influence, dined with a colleague at a modest but well-regarded restaurant. Gregory had been at La Maison Daylight the night before, watching the interaction between Ethan and Samuel with detached curiosity. Do you know who that man was? His colleague? Victor Cross asked as their server poured wine. Ethan Lancaster, Gregory replied. Tech mogul, likes to think of himself as a kingmaker. And the other man? Victor leaned forward slightly, his expression interested. Samuel Carter, Gregory said, his voice soft but deliberate. An investor, a philanthropist. Someone who doesn't need to prove himself. Victor raised an eyebrow. Lancaster chose the wrong man to antagonize. Then, Gregory smiled faintly, swirling his wine. Indeed, but I don't think Lancaster realizes that yet. People like him never do, not until it's too late. In the days that followed, Ethan's discomfort began to ripple outward. His investors, though polite, became less responsive. A few postponed meetings without explanation. Ethan chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of business. But something about their tone felt off. Almost cautious. At the same time, Samuel Carter moved forward with his life. Unaffected, or so it seemed. He attended meetings, finalized a new partnership for his foundation, and spent evenings at home with his family. Yet beneath his calm exterior, he couldn't entirely shake the memory of Ethan's expression, the tightly controlled smile. The faint but unmistakable condescension. It was a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there would always be those who saw him as an outsider. But Samuel had long since decided not to carry the weight of other people's discomfort. His focus remained on the things he could control, his work, his family, and the values that guided his life. For Ethan, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. He didn't yet understand the full extent of what had been set in motion. But he could sense it, a faint, uneasy shift in the ground beneath him. And in the quiet spaces between his thoughts, he wondered if the life he had built, the power he had amassed, was as solid as he had always believed. Or if, like so many things, it could crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The hum of Ethan Lancaster's office was quieter than usual. He had grown accustomed to the constant rhythm of calls, the soft chatter of his team strategizing in the background, the steady influx of emails demanding his attention. But this morning, the silence felt heavier, as though the building itself was holding its breath. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking faintly under his weight, and stared at the spreadsheet on his screen. It showed a steady decline, projected earnings falling short, investments delayed or withdrawn. Ethan's hand hovered over his mouse. But he didn't click. He couldn't seem to summon the energy to act, to fix what was unraveling before his eyes. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts, landing on the names of two critical investors, Gregory Blake and Victor Cross. Both had withdrawn their support just days earlier. Their messages polite but final. It didn't make sense to Ethan. He had courted their interest meticulously, offering them prime opportunities in his company's upcoming expansion. Their sudden coldness felt personal, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He thought of calling them, demanding an explanation, but a sliver of doubt stopped him. Ethan had always operated from a place of confidence, a belief that his success was proof of his superiority. Yet now, for the first time, he felt unsure not of his abilities, but of the ground beneath his feet. Across town, Samuel Carter sat in a modest yet elegant conference room, reviewing plans for a new community initiative. The foundation, run by his wife Celeste, had been quietly building momentum, securing partnerships that would expand its reach into underserved neighborhoods. Celeste entered the room, a cup of tea in her hand. She placed it on the table in front of Samuel, her movements unhurried. "You've been quiet," she said, sitting across from him. Samuel glanced up, offering her a faint smile. "Just thinking. About the man from the restaurant?" she asked, her tone gentle but perceptive. Samuel nodded. "In a way, it's not him, specifically, it's what he represents." Celeste sipped her tea, waiting. Samuel had a way of processing his thoughts slowly, deliberately. She knew he would speak when he was ready. He thought he was teaching us a lesson. Samuel said finally, his voice calm, but it was his own discomfort that gave him away. "People like him, they don't see themselves clearly. They confuse their privilege with strength, their arrogance with power." Celeste regarded him for a moment. "And yet, it's not our job to teach them. That's for the world to do." Samuel nodded, a quiet agreement passing between them. He respected his wife's perspective, her ability to navigate the complexities of these moments without letting them weigh her down. She had always been better at letting go of the things she couldn't change. Back at Ethan's office, his assistant Claire entered with a folder in hand. "Mr. Lancaster," she began hesitantly, "I thought you should see this." Ethan gestured for her to set it down. "What is it?" "It's the updated investor list for the expansion," she said softly. "Several more have pulled out. They're citing concerns about company direction." Ethan flipped through the documents, his frown deepening with each page. The names of once loyal backers were crossed out, replaced with vague notes about postponed meetings and reassessments. He felt the first flicker of panic. "How many?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "6, Claire replied, "including Gregory Blake and Victor Cross." Ethan's hand tightened around the folder. "Get me their numbers. I want to talk to them." Claire nodded and left, but as the door closed behind her, Ethan slumped back in his chair. He knew that calls wouldn't fix this. Something larger was at play, something beyond his control. That evening, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, nursing a glass of bourbon. The city lights twinkled beyond the window, their usual brilliance dulled in his eyes. He had spent the afternoon calling investors, trying to salvage what he could. But the responses had been evasive, their polite refusals laced with an unspoken discomfort. It wasn't just about business, Ethan realized. It was about him. The memory of Samuel Carter returned. Unbidden, the man's calm demeanor, his refusal to rise to Ethan's bait, had lingered in Ethan's mind ever since their encounter. At the time, Ethan had dismissed Samuel as insignificant, a man out of his depth in a world he couldn't truly belong to. But now, Ethan saw that he had miscalculated. Samuel hadn't been out of his depth. He had been steady, unshaken, while Ethan had been the one grasping for control. That realization gnawed at Ethan, though he couldn't quite name the emotion it stirred. Shame? Regret? He didn't know. Meanwhile, Gregory Blake and Victor Cross met for dinner in a quiet restaurant. The conversation drifted naturally to Ethan Lancaster, whose name had been circulating among their circles in recent days. "He's unraveling," Gregory said, his tone detached. "I've been hearing things, investors pulling out, staff losing confidence." Victor nodded. It was bound to happen. His arrogance was always going to catch up with him. "Do you think he knows why?" Gregory asked, a faint note of curiosity in his voice. Victor sipped his wine thoughtfully. "Not yet, but he will. Men like him always do. Eventually." As the week wore on, Ethan's position became increasingly precarious. The whispers in the hallways of his company grew louder, and even his board of directors began to show signs of unease. Meetings that once ended with confident agreements now concluded with vague promises to revisit the conversation later. Ethan's frustration boiled over during a quarterly review, where one of his senior executives cautiously questioned the expansion plans. "We need to be certain about the timing," the executive had said. "The market is volatile, and there's hesitation among our partners." Hesitation? Ethan had snapped. From who? The room fell silent. No one answered. In the quiet moments of the day, when the noise of meetings and phone calls faded, Ethan found himself reflecting more often. He thought about the assumptions he had made, The ways he had dismissed people who didn't fit into his world. He thought about Samuel Carter. About the calm strength that had unnerved him so deeply. For the first time, Ethan began to wonder if the cracks forming in his carefully constructed life weren't just external. Perhaps they had always been there, waiting for the right moment to appear. And perhaps, Ethan thought with a pang of unease, they were a reflection of something he had always refused to see. The day Ethan Lancaster had dreaded arrived quietly. With little ceremony, the board of directors summoned him to a meeting. Their email brief and formal. He had known this moment was inevitable. Yet it still stung. For years, Ethan had been the center of gravity within his company. His vision, his ambition, his wealth had propelled it to the top. Now, those same qualities were being quietly questioned. Ethan walked into the boardroom wearing the same tailored suit he had worn during countless victorious meetings. But this time, the air was different. The directors avoided his eyes. Their postures stiff. David Burns, the chairman, cleared his throat before speaking. Ethan, he began, his voice steady but cautious. The board has reviewed recent developments. And we believe a change in leadership is necessary for the company's future stability. The words hung in the air like a fog. Ethan stared at the table, his hands resting on the polished wood. He could feel the weight of their collective decision. The finality of it, effective immediately. Burns continued, "You will step down as CEO. We've prepared a severance package and an advisory role should you choose to accept it." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. He looked around at the faces of the people he had once commanded with ease. Now, they watched him with a mix of pity and relief. "I understand," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. He stood, gathering his belongings with deliberate care. There was no point in fighting. The empire he had built was no longer his. As he left the boardroom, the door closing softly behind him, Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. The anger he had anticipated didn't come. Instead, there was only a hollow resignation. The days that followed were marked by a stillness Ethan hadn't experienced in years. His phone, once a constant source of activity, was eerily silent. The emails that trickled in were mostly transactional formal notices. Final updates. The people who had once clamored for his attention now seemed distant. Their absence amplifying the emptiness of his new reality. Ethan spent his mornings pacing his apartment. A spacious but impersonal penthouse with a view of the city skyline. He would sit by the window, watching the bustling streets below, feeling disconnected from it all. For years, he had seen himself as part of the city's pulse, a force that shaped its rhythms. Now, he was just another observer. His thoughts often drifted back to La Maison Daylight, to the moment when everything had begun to unravel. He remembered the look on Samuel Carter's face, calm, composed, unshaken. Ethan had tried to assert his dominance that night, but Samuel had not played the role Ethan had expected. Instead, it was Ethan who had been left exposed. His insecurities laid bare. Ethan thought about Samuel and his family often in those quiet moments. Their dignity had unsettled him then, and it still lingered now, challenging the narrative Ethan had always told himself. He had prided himself on being a self-made man, a symbol of success and power. But what good was any of it if it could be so easily dismantled? One afternoon, Ethan ventured out for a walk, something he hadn't done in years. He wandered through the city, the streets familiar yet strangely alien, the faces of passers-by blurred together, their expressions indifferent. Ethan turned onto a quieter street, finding himself in front of a small park. He sat on a bench, the cool breeze rustling the trees overhead. Around him, children played on swings while parents watched from nearby benches. The scene was simple, ordinary, yet it filled Ethan with a sense of longing he couldn't quite name. He thought about the life he had built, the choices he had made. He thought about the moments he had dismissed people, assumed their worth based on superficial markers of success. And he thought about Samuel, a man who seemed to carry his worth within him, unshaken by the judgments of others. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his own arrogance not as a source of strength, but as a burden he had been carrying for far too long. Meanwhile, at the Carter Foundation, Samuel and Celeste were preparing for a fundraiser to support their latest initiative. The event was small, intimate, attended by people who shared their vision for building stronger communities. As Samuel greeted guests, he couldn't help but notice how different this world was from the one Ethan Lancaster inhabited. Here, success wasn't measured by wealth or influence but by the ability to uplift others. It was a quieter kind of power, one that Samuel had come to value deeply. Later that evening, as Samuel and Celeste walked home together, she asked him about Ethan. "Do you think he's learned anything from all of this?" she said. Her voice curious but not unkind. Samuel thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know. People like him. It's hard for them to let go of the narratives they've built around themselves. But sometimes, losing everything is the only way to see what truly matters." Celeste nodded, her arm linked with his. "I hope he finds his way," she said softly. "So do I," Samuel replied, his tone reflective. "Not for his sake, but for the people he could help if he does." Back at his apartment, Ethan sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. He had spent the past hour trying to write a letter to Samuel. But the words felt inadequate. Apologies were not something Ethan was accustomed to. He didn't know how to convey what he was feeling: regret, humility, an overwhelming sense of loss. Finally, he began to write. "Samuel, I owe you an apology. I see now that my actions were not just wrong but rooted in ignorance and arrogance. I've spent my life believing success was about power and control. But I was wrong. Watching you and your family that night, I saw a strength I didn't understand. I still have a long way to go. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying. Thank you for showing me what I was too blind to see. Ethan Lancaster." Ethan folded the letter carefully and set it aside. He didn't know if Samuel would respond. But that wasn't the point. For the first time, Ethan understood that some lessons didn't come with resolution. They came with the quiet work of rebuilding, one small step at a time. And as he sat in the stillness of his apartment, Ethan felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The world had grown quieter for Ethan Lancaster. Weeks had passed since his removal as CEO, and the rhythm of his life had slowed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The frantic pace that once defined his days, meetings, deals, constant movement was gone. In its absence, he had found something unexpected: space. Space to think, to reflect, and to confront the emptiness that had always lingered beneath his success. He spent much of his time walking the city streets, no longer hurried by schedules or obligations. These walks became meditative, a way to process the changes in his life. On one such morning, as he passed a modest office building, his eyes caught the sign outside, "The Carter Foundation." He stopped, his gaze lingering on the simple lettering. It had been weeks since he'd written the letter to Samuel Carter, and though he hadn't received a response, he felt no resentment. He didn't expect absolution. But standing there, outside the foundation, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Ethan stepped inside, the hum of quiet activity greeting him. The receptionist at the front desk looked up with a welcoming smile. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Carter," Ethan said, his voice steady but low. "If he's available." The receptionist made a quick phone call, her tone polite but cautious. After a moment, she nodded and gestured toward a small seating area. "Mr. Carter will be with you shortly." Ethan sat, his hands resting on his knees. The space around him was warm and unpretentious, its walls lined with photos of community events and framed certificates of recognition. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, impersonal offices he had once commanded. A few minutes later, Samuel Carter appeared, his expression calm and unreadable. He extended a hand. "Mr. Lancaster," he said evenly, "what brings you here?" Ethan stood and shook Samuel's hand, noticing the firm but measured grip. I wanted to thank you," Ethan began, his words deliberate. "Not for anything you did, but for what you didn't do." Samuel raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing Ethan to continue. "That night at the restaurant, I thought I was in control," Ethan admitted. "I thought I was teaching you a lesson. But the truth is, you showed me something I wasn't ready to see. My arrogance, my assumptions, it was all a facade. hiding how fragile my success really was. Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze steady. And now? He asked. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. Now I'm trying to rebuild. Not my company, not my reputation, myself. I don't know if I'm doing it right. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Samuel gestured toward a nearby meeting room. Let's talk, he said simply. The conversation that followed was quiet and unhurried. Ethan shared parts of his journey, the rise, the fall, and the introspection that had followed. Samuel listened without interruption, his face revealing little. When Ethan finished, Samuel leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed loosely. You're not the first person to come to this realization, Samuel said finally, and you won't be the last. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Ethan looked down at his hands, the weight of the question settling over him. I want to help, he said, not to make amends or to rebuild my image, but because I realize now that I never really contributed to anything meaningful. I have resources, connections, I want to use them for something good. Samuel studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then start small, talk less, listen more, and remember that real change isn't about grand gestures, it's about consistency. Over the weeks that followed, Ethan began volunteering with the Carter Foundation. At first, he kept a low profile, helping with administrative tasks and attending community events as an observer. He didn't announce his presence or leverage his name for attention. Instead, he focused on learning. He listened to the stories of the people the foundation served, single mothers struggling to make ends meet, young students overcoming systemic barriers, retired workers seeking new ways to contribute. Their resilience humbled him, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt a connection to something larger than himself. Samuel watched Ethan's transformation with quiet interest. He had seen others attempt to reinvent themselves, often for the wrong reasons. But Ethan's humility seemed genuine. He asked questions, sought guidance, and most importantly showed up. Week after week, months later, Ethan found himself back at La Maison Daylight, this time as a guest of the Carter family. It was a quiet dinner, arranged to celebrate the foundation's latest success. Ethan sat at the same table where Samuel and Celeste had once endured his condescension. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared stories. Ethan listened more than he spoke, his presence unobtrusive but engaged. As the evening wound down, he looked around the table, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. When Samuel caught his eye, Ethan smiled faintly. Thank you, he said, the words carrying more weight than he expected. Samuel returned the smile, his expression one of quiet understanding. It's not about thanks, he replied. It's about what you do next. Ethan nodded, the truth of those words settling deeply within him. For the first time, he felt at peace, not because he had redeemed himself, but because he had started walking a path that felt authentic. And as he left the restaurant that night, Ethan realized that the journey ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time, he welcomed it.